little girl ran out of the school restroom, tears streaming down her face. She grabbed the janitor's shirt, her hands shaking. Sue locked the door. You won't believe what happened next. A dark secret is hidden inside this school, and someone doesn't want the truth to come out. Watch until the end to uncover this chilling mystery. If you love thrilling stories, hit like and subscribe now. Don't miss the next shocking episode. The dimly lit hallway of Redwood Elementary was silent, except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. The scent of floor polish lingered in the air as James Carter, a 48-year-old custodian, methodically moved his mop across the polished tiles. The rhythmic swish was almost therapeutic, a routine that kept his mind occupied. But tonight, something felt off. A sharp bang echoed down the corridor, a door slamming open. Then, hurried footsteps. James turned just in time to see Sophie Langley, a second grader with dark curls and wide, frightened eyes, stumble out of the girls' restroom. Her tiny frame trembled, her breath hitching between gasps. She was crying. James dropped his mop. "Sophie?" he called, his voice laced with concern. Sophie darted her gaze down the hallway as if checking for someone. Then, with shaky legs, she ran straight into his arms, gripping his uniform with desperate fingers. James crouched down, keeping his voice gentle. "Sweetheart, what happened?" Sophie's chest heaved. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She was struggling to speak. James' heart pounded. Something was wrong. Finally, her voice came, a whisper so faint he had to lean in. "He locked the door." James stiffened, his mind reeled. "Who did?" Sophie didn't answer. She only shook her head violently, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. Her hands trembled, still clutching his sleeve. James forced himself to stay calm, though his instincts screamed otherwise. He needed to get her somewhere safe. Now. "Sophie, you're okay now," he murmured, lifting her carefully into his arms. "Let's go see Nurse Abigail. She'll help, I promise." As he carried her down the hall, he glanced back at the restroom door, slightly ajar, swinging ever so slightly as if someone had left in a hurry. James wasn't alone in the hallway. A shadow flickered near the stairwell at the far end of the corridor, someone watching. Then, in an instant, they were gone. A school that wants silence. James pushed open the door to the nurse's office, where Abigail Monroe was sorting through medical supplies. She barely had time to look up before James strode in, urgency radiating off him. "Abby, I need your help," he said, setting Sophie down on the small cot. Abigail immediately kneeled beside the girl, concern etched on her face. "Sophie, sweetheart, can you tell me what's wrong?" The little girl only clung to James, her sobs muffled against his uniform. James's jaw tightened. He looked at Abigail. She said someone locked the door on her. Abigail's brows furrowed and she shot him a knowing glance. Something wasn't right. "Sophie? Was it another student?" Abigail asked softly. Sophie didn't respond. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a small, metal key, one that didn't belong to her. James and Abigail exchanged a look. This wasn't just a prank. This was something much, much worse. And someone in this school didn't want it getting out. James Carter's grip tightened on the small metal key in his palm. It was cold, slightly worn at the edges. Not the kind of key a 7-year-old should have. Sophie Langley had barely spoken since he carried her into the nurse's office. Now she sat curled up on the cot, staring blankly at the floor, as if willing herself to disappear. Abigail Monroe, the school nurse, stood beside James, her lips pressed into a thin line. "This isn't the first time, James," she murmured under her breath. His stomach clenched. "What do you mean?" Abigail glanced at Sophie before lowering her voice. "I've seen her in here before. Stomach aches, headaches, always looking over her shoulder. I assumed it was nerves, but—" She trailed off. James knew what she meant. Something was happening in Redwood Elementary, and the people in charge weren't paying attention. Or worse, they were ignoring it. James turned to Sophie, kneeling so they were at eye level. "Sweetheart, I need to ask you something important. Did someone give you this key?" Sophie hesitated, her small fingers tightening around the edge of the cot. For a long moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, barely above a whisper, she muttered, "It was on the floor." James felt a chill creep down his spine. "Where?" he pressed gently. Sophie's fingers dug into the blanket, her breathing shallow. Then, finally, she whispered, "Under the sink," after he left. James exchanged a glance with Abigail. The girls' restroom, the key, and someone leaving before Sophie could get out. He exhaled sharply, his heart hammering against his ribs. He needed answers. Now, I'll be back, he told Abigail before heading toward the door. James, she called after him, a warning in her voice. Don't do anything reckless. But James was already gone. A principal with a convenient excuse. Steps echoed through the empty hallway as he approached the front office. He had been at Redwood Elementary long enough to know that going straight to the police without proof would mean nothing. If anyone was going to get to the bottom of this, it had to start with the man in charge. Principal Douglas Whitmore sat behind his massive oak desk, his suit crisp, his silver-framed glasses perched neatly on his nose. The office smelled of leather and stale coffee. "Mr. Carter?" Whitmore greeted, barely looking up from his papers. "Something I can help you with?" James didn't bother sitting down. He held up the small metal key. "One of the students found this in the girls' restroom after being locked inside." Whitmore's eyes flicked up, but his expression remained unreadable. "And?" James stiffened. "She was scared out of her mind. She said someone left before she could get out." Whitmore sighed, setting down his pen. "James, do you know how many times kids make up stories? You've worked here long enough to see it yourself." James felt heat rise in his chest. "This isn't a story. A child was locked in a bathroom. She has this key. Someone was in there before her, and we both know that door doesn't just lock itself." Whitmore leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. "James, I appreciate your concern, but let's not make assumptions. Kids drop things all the time. That key could belong to a teacher or the janitorial staff." "Except I know all the keys we use," James shot back. "And this isn't one of them." Whitmore's jaw tightened. "You're out of line, Carter." James clenched his fists. "No, what's out of line is ignoring a scared little girl who—" "Enough." Whitmore's voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone that ended arguments before they began. James's stomach churned. "You're a janitor, James. A damn good one. But this is not your job." Whitmore continued, standing up. "I'll handle it. You can go back to your duties." James felt rage bubbling in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "And how exactly will you handle it?" Whitmore's lips curled into a polite, empty smile. "By following protocol, of course." James had seen that smile before. It was the kind people wore when they were hiding something. A warning not to dig too deep. James turned on his heel and stormed out of the office. His pulse pounded in his ears. He had expected resistance, but this was a cover-up. He made it halfway down the hall when he heard Whitmore's voice call after him. "James." He turned slowly, gripping the key in his fist. The principal stood in the doorway, his expression now completely unreadable. "Be careful where you dig," he said, voice low. James held his gaze. "Or what?" Whitmore smiled again. "Just a friendly warning. Redwood has rules, and those who break them don't stay long." The door shut behind him. James exhaled, his breath shaky. This wasn't just about one incident. This wasn't just about Sophie. Something deeply wrong was happening in this school. And now, he was officially part of it. James Carter gripped the mystery key so tightly it left an imprint in his palm. The principal's warning still echoed in his ears. "Be careful where you dig." He wasn't the type to back down, especially not when a scared little girl had just told him someone locked her in that bathroom. And now, there was a key that shouldn't exist. James wasn't leaving without answers. The restroom holds its own secrets. The school hallways were silent now, most of the students already in their classrooms. James walked quickly toward the girls' restroom, his eyes scanning the corridor for any unwanted attention. He reached the door and pushed it open. Empty. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, flickering slightly, casting faint shadows against the tiled walls. James stepped inside and let the door swing shut behind him. The first thing he checked was the lock. He crouched down and tested the mechanism. It was an old-style lock, one that could only be engaged from the inside unless someone used a key from the outside. His stomach twisted. So someone had locked Sophie in. His gaze moved to the sink, where she had said she found the key. He knelt down, running his fingers along the dusty underside of the basin. Smooth ceramic. But then, his fingertips brushed against something rough, a folded piece of paper wedged into the corner. James carefully pulled it free, unfolding it with steady hands. 4 words written in small, shaky handwriting. "He watches from upstairs." James's breath hitched. Who wrote this? A sound outside made him freeze. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. James quickly shoved the note into his pocket, heart hammering. He stood, stepping toward the door, but before he could push it open, the handle twisted. Someone was trying to come in. A close call. James pressed himself against the tiled wall, breath held. The door rattled slightly, then nothing. Silence. Then the footsteps faded away. James exhaled, forcing himself to stay calm. Whoever had tried to come in, they hadn't wanted to be seen. When he finally stepped out into the hallway, he scanned in both directions. Empty, but someone had been there, watching. And if this was a warning, it meant he was getting close. The teacher who left in a hurry. James knew there was only one person who might help him piece this together. Abigail Monroe. 10 minutes later, he was back in the nurse's office. Abigail was sorting through files when he entered, her eyes immediately narrowing. "James, please tell me you didn't do something reckless." He placed the folded note on her desk. Her gaze flicked over it, reading the words, and James watched as her face paled. Then she closed the office door. "Where did you get this?" she asked, voice low. "Girls' restroom, under the sink," James replied. "Sophie didn't write it, it was already there." Abigail stared at the note, her fingers pressing lightly against its edges. James could see her hesitating. "You know something," he said, "don't you?" She sighed, rubbing her temple. "A few years ago there was a teacher here, a woman named Lena Shaw. She left suddenly, no explanation, but before she did, she came to me one afternoon, shaken up, said she didn't feel safe here anymore." James leaned forward. "Why?" Abigail hesitated. "She wouldn't tell me specifics, but she mentioned the 3rd floor. James frowned. "The 3rd floor? There's nothing there anymore," Abigail said. "Administration closed it off years ago after a pipe burst. Only storage now." James's stomach tightened. A storage area. And yet the note said, "He watches from upstairs." A door that shouldn't be open. By the time James reached the 3rd floor stairwell, his instincts screamed at him to turn back. Instead, he pushed forward. The school's 3rd floor was supposed to be locked, abandoned. Yet as James climbed the last few steps, he saw something that made his breath catch. The door wasn't shut all the way. Someone had been here recently. James slowly pushed it open, stepping into the dimly lit corridor. The air was different here. Stale, undisturbed. Storage boxes were stacked haphazardly, dust coating the floor, but there was a trail of footprints leading deeper into the hallway. James followed them, his heartbeat steady but alert. At the very end of the corridor, a small maintenance door stood slightly ajar. James swallowed hard. He reached for the handle. The second he touched it, a loud noise cracked through the silence, a metallic clang, a door slamming shut somewhere behind him. James spun around. The hallway was empty. But James knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone. James Carter stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway of the 3rd floor, his breath slow and controlled. A moment ago he had heard something. A door slamming, but the corridor was empty, or at least, it looked empty. His pulse hammered against his ribs as he took a cautious step forward. The faint footprints in the dust led to a half-open maintenance room door. Whoever had been up here was still nearby. A room that shouldn't exist. James pressed a hand to the door and nudged it open. The rusty hinges groaned in protest. The room was small, cramped like a supply closet. Dust particles floated in the dim light that filtered through a single narrow window. Old chairs, broken desks, and a filing cabinet lined the walls. But James wasn't looking at any of that. His focus locked on the chair in the center of the room. It was facing the wall. Something about it felt off. James hesitated. Then, carefully, he stepped forward and placed a hand on the chair's backrest. With slow, deliberate movement, he turned it around. His blood ran ice cold. Sitting on the chair was a neatly folded uniform shirt. A child's uniform. James took a step back, his breath shallow. The shirt was clean, but the way it was carefully folded and placed on the chair sent a sick feeling curling in his stomach. What the hell was this? He scanned the room again, this time with sharper eyes. And that's when he saw it. A door. Not the one he had entered through. A second hidden door, tucked behind a shelving unit, just slightly ajar. James stepped toward it, ignoring the prickling sensation at the back of his neck. He pushed it open and froze. A silent witness. It was a watching room. A tiny, windowless space with nothing inside but a single wooden chair, positioned directly in front of a one-way mirror. James's stomach twisted as he stepped closer. Through the mirror's other side, he could see into a classroom below. He knew this room. It was a private counseling office for at-risk students, tucked away near the back of the school. Someone had been sitting here, watching. His fingers tightened into fists. Had this been going on for years? A chill passed through him, but before he could process it, a creak behind him. James spun around, but the room was empty. Still, the feeling remained. Someone had been here. Someone was still watching. An unwelcome visit. James didn't run, but he walked quickly. His instincts screamed at him to get out of the third floor before he was caught. By the time he reached the main hallways of the school, classes were still in session. The normalcy of it all felt wrong. His mind raced. The uniform, the watching room, the one-way mirror. This wasn't just about Sophie anymore. Someone had done this before. James headed straight to the nurse's office. Abigail Monroe looked up when he entered, immediately noticing the look on his face. "What did you find?" James locked the door behind him. "A room," he said, voice low. "A hidden one. Someone's been watching kids." Abigail's face went pale. "Where?" "Third floor. And I found this." James pulled out his phone, showing her the picture he had snapped of the neatly folded uniform on the chair. She exhaled sharply. "That's—" A knock at the office door cut her off. Both of them stiffened. James moved to open it, but Abigail stopped him. She looked through the small window first, her body going rigid. Then, in a whisper, she said, "It's him." James's stomach dropped. Through the glass, Principal Douglas Whitmore stood on the other side. His expression unreadable. But his eyes, they were locked directly on James. A dangerous conversation. James opened the door, schooling his expression into one of neutrality. "Mr. Carter," Whitmore greeted, his usual smooth tone in place. "I was hoping to speak with you privately." James didn't move. "I'm busy." Whitmore smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "Walk with me," he said. Abigail shot James a warning look, but he nodded subtly. He had no choice. He followed Whitmore into the hallway. For the first few steps, neither of them spoke. Then Whitmore said, "I understand you've been curious about certain parts of the school." James kept his face blank. "That so?" Whitmore chuckled lightly. "James, we all have our roles here. Yours is to clean. Mine is to run this institution." James felt the subtle threat woven into those words. Whitmore stopped walking and turned to face him. The hallway was empty, the school silent except for the faint murmur of classrooms in session. The principal's smile faded. "Curiosity," he said smoothly, "has consequences?" James's jaw clenched. "That a threat?" Whitmore sighed as if disappointed. "Not at all, it's a reminder." Then, stepping closer, he added in a low voice, "You wouldn't want to lose your job, would you?" Fists tightened. "Because accidents happen," Whitmore continued, "and I'd hate for you to be involved in one." Silence. Then finally, James stepped forward, close enough that Whitmore had to tilt his head slightly to keep eye contact. "You know what I think?" James murmured. Whitmore raised an eyebrow. James smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I think you're scared." Whitmore's eyes darkened. But James didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked away, leaving the principal standing in the empty hallway. His heart was pounding. He had pushed back, but he had also just put a target on his back. And now, Whitmore would be watching. James Carter's mind raced as he walked away from Principal Whitmore, but he kept his steps steady, forcing himself not to look back. He knew what had just happened. Whitmore had threatened him, and James had called his bluff. But deep down, he knew the man wasn't bluffing. James had seen fear in Whitmore's eyes, not the kind of fear that came from being falsely accused. No, the kind of fear that came from knowing the walls were closing in. The missing student files. James didn't go straight back to the janitor's closet. He needed more proof. If Whitmore had been watching students, there had to be records somewhere. And James had a feeling he knew where to start. Instead of heading to his usual cleaning duties, he took a detour to the records office. It was a small, tucked-away room near administration, where the school kept old student files and incident reports. Most staff didn't have access. But James had keys to every door. He waited until the hallway was clear, then slipped inside, shutting the door behind him. The scent of old paper and disinfectant filled the room. Rows of filing cabinets lined the walls. James scanned them quickly until he found what he was looking for. Student incident reports. He pulled open the drawer and flipped through the files, his fingers moving quickly. Some were routine, fights, injuries, minor infractions. Then he saw something strange, a gap. The files were labeled alphabetically, but one was missing. James frowned, scanning the names. The files jumped from Shaw Daniel to Smith Carly. Where the hell was the missing one? James' pulse quickened. He checked the surrounding cabinets, but the missing folder wasn't there. Someone had removed it. His gut told him it wasn't an accident. A bad feeling. James had just started snapping pictures of the files with his phone when he heard a sound that made his blood turn cold. The doorknob rattled. Someone was outside. James froze. He quickly stepped back, scanning for a hiding spot, but there was nowhere in the small office. The rattling stopped. Then, after a beat, a slow, deliberate knock. James didn't answer. His heart pounded as silence stretched on the other side. Then, a piece of paper slid under the door. James hesitated before bending down to grab it. 4 words were scrawled across it in hurried, almost desperate handwriting. "You need to stop." James's stomach twisted. He grabbed the note and yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. Whoever had left the note was gone. A pattern of silence. James walked quickly toward the nurse's office, the note still clenched in his fist. Abigail Monroe looked up as he entered, and the second she saw his face, she locked the door behind him. "You found something," she said. James handed her the note. "This was slipped under the door while I was in records. And there's a missing file. Someone didn't want me to see it." Abigail scanned the note, her expression darkening. "Who gave this to you?" "I don't know," James admitted, "but whoever it was, they were scared." Abigail exhaled, rubbing her forehead. "This is bigger than we thought." James crossed his arms. "Tell me what you know, Abby." She hesitated, then finally said, "A few years ago, a student went missing. A girl. It wasn't during school hours, so officially it wasn't considered our problem. But she had been coming to see me for weeks before that. Stomach aches, headaches, anxiety, same as Sophie." James's throat tightened. "What happened to her?" "She was never found," Abigail said softly. "Her family moved away a few months later. No one talked about it after that." James ran a hand over his face. "And you think that missing file, it could be her?" Abigail confirmed. "A missing child, a missing file, and a principal covering his tracks." The second warning. James' gut told him they were running out of time. Someone inside the school wanted him to stop digging, badly. And if they were willing to erase records, what else were they capable of? As James turned to leave, Abigail caught his arm. "Wait," he looked at her. She hesitated, then said, "I think I know someone who can help." "Who?" Abigail bit her lip. "A former teacher, Lena Shaw." James frowned. "The one who left suddenly?" Abigail nodded. "She told me once that Whitmore was hiding something. I never got the chance to ask her more. But if anyone knows what's really going on, it's her." James straightened. "Where is she now?" Abigail hesitated. "She doesn't like to talk about what happened here. But I heard she still lives in town. If we find her, maybe we can finally get some answers." James nodded, determination settling in his gut. "Then let's find her." But before he could step outside, his phone buzzed. He pulled it out and frowned. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered, "Hello?" For a second, nothing. Then, in a hushed, almost panicked whisper, a woman's voice said, "Stop looking. It's already too late." The line went dead. James's blood turned to ice. Abigail stared at him. "Who was that?" James lowered the phone. "I think we just found Lena Shaw." James Carter stared at his phone, the warning from Lena Shaw still ringing in his ears. "Stop looking. It's already too late." The line had gone dead. No callback, no second chance to ask questions. Abigail Monroe looked at him, concern creasing her brow. "Was that her?" James nodded. "Yeah, and she's scared." Abigail folded her arms. "Then we need to find her before she disappears too." The meeting place. Finding Lena Shaw wasn't easy. Abigail reached out to an old friend in the district, who confirmed that Lena was still living in town, but she had cut ties with everyone from Redwood Elementary. No social media, no listed phone number. Finally, after hours of searching, Abigail managed to get an address. It led them to a rundown house on the far side of town, tucked away behind an overgrown lawn and a rusting mailbox with faded numbers. James pulled up to the curb, his gut already telling him this wouldn't be a friendly reunion. They stepped up to the front porch, and Abigail knocked. Silence. James tried again, louder this time. A shadow moved behind the curtains. Then a voice, tense and hushed, "Go away." James exchanged a look with Abigail before stepping closer to the door. "Lena, my name is James Carter. I work at Redwood." Silence. "We know what's happening," he pressed. "We found the room. We know about Whitmore." The door unlocked. Slowly, it creaked open just enough for them to see a pale, exhausted woman with dark circles under her eyes. Lena Shaw. She didn't look relieved to see them. If anything, she looked terrified. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. James took a step forward. "Lena, please, we need your help." She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to be watching. Then, finally, she pulled the door open and motioned them inside. A hidden truth. The house was bare, few decorations. Boxes stacked in the corners, as if she had been ready to leave at any moment. Lena locked the door behind them. She didn't offer them a seat. Instead, she folded her arms and whispered, "If you're smart, you'll drop this right now." James met her gaze. "We can't." Lena exhaled sharply, running a hand through her unkempt hair. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" "We know Whitmore's been covering things up," Abigail said. Lena let out a bitter laugh. "Covering up? You think this started with him?" James frowned. "What are you saying?" Lena looked away, chewing on her lip. Then, finally, she whispered, "This has been going on for years." James felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. Lena stepped toward the window, peering outside. "It's not just Whitmore. It's people above him, people who make sure things get buried. When I started asking questions, I got a warning, then another. Then I was told I could either quit or I'd disappear like the others." James's stomach tightened. "The others?" Lena swallowed hard. "You found the files, didn't you?" James nodded. "One was missing." Lena turned to face him, her expression haunted. "Because that girl wasn't the only one." Abigail's breath hitched. "How many?" Lena's voice shook. "5." James felt like the air had been sucked from the room. 5 missing children. And no one ever connected the cases, because someone had made sure they never would. A silent car outside. Lena looked at James, her voice urgent. "You need to listen to me. You think you're in control, but you're not. The second you started digging, they started watching you." James clenched his fists. "Then let them watch." Lena shook her head. "That's exactly what they want." Abigail frowned. "Lena, we have proof. If we go to the police..." Lena let out a dry, humorless laugh. "The police? Do you know how many reports I filed? How many parents begged for investigations?" James and Abigail fell silent. Lena's voice dropped. Every single one of those families was silenced. Some were paid off, some were threatened, and the ones who refused, she swallowed hard. They left town, fast. James felt anger burn in his chest. "Then how do we stop them?" Lena hesitated. Then, as if making a painful decision, she whispered, "There's one person who might be able to help you." "Who?" Lena licked her lips. "A woman named Dana Holloway. She was a journalist, the only one who ever got close to publishing the truth." James frowned. "What happened to her?" Lena hesitated. Then finally she whispered, "She died in a car accident 3 days before her story was set to go public." A heavy silence filled the room. James exhaled. "Then what do we do?" Lena's eyes locked onto his. "You find her notes." Abigail straightened. "You think she kept a backup?" Lena nodded. "I know she did, and if you find them, you'll finally have something they can't erase." James felt the weight of the task settle on his shoulders. They weren't just dealing with Whitmore. They were dealing with something much bigger. And now there was no turning back. The watchers make their move. Before James could respond, a car engine rumbled outside. Lena's face went white. "Who's that?" Abigail whispered. James moved quickly to the window, peering out. A black sedan was parked across the street. The engine idled, but no one got out. The windows were tinted, and though James couldn't see their faces, he knew whoever was inside was watching them. Lena gripped his arm. "You need to leave. Now." James clenched his jaw. "Not without those notes." Lena hesitated. Then, quickly, she rushed to a cabinet, yanked open a drawer, and pulled out an address scrawled on a piece of paper. "This is where Dana lived," she whispered, pressing it into his hand. "If there's anything left of her research, it'll be there." James tucked the paper into his pocket, his mind already racing. Abigail swallowed hard. "And what about you?" Lena looked at them with haunted eyes. "I was never here," she whispered. James didn't argue. As he and Abigail slipped out the back door, he cast one last look at the silent car parked outside. He had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time he saw it. And next time, he wouldn't be able to walk away so easily. James Carter gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove away from Lena Shaw's house, his mind racing. Beside him, Abigail Monroe sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her eyes flicking toward the rearview mirror every few seconds. Because the black sedan was still behind them. It wasn't tailgating, wasn't trying to be obvious, but it was there. Watching, waiting. James didn't say anything. Instead, he made 4 quick turns down different streets. When he glanced back, the sedan was still there. Abigail inhaled sharply. They're not even trying to hide it. James clenched his jaw. They don't have to. Whoever these people were, they wanted him to know he was being followed. They weren't afraid. But maybe they should be. A dead journalist's home. 20 minutes later, James pulled up in front of a rundown house on the outskirts of town. Dana Holloway's old home. The address Lena had given him. It had been vacant for years. A faded, "For sale" sign leaned crookedly in the yard, and the windows were coated with dust. James killed the engine and turned to Abigail. If she kept a backup of her research, it's in there. Abigail swallowed. And what if someone already took it? James exhaled. Then we just walked into a trap. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then, finally, James pushed open the door. Breaking in. The front door was locked. No surprise there. James moved around the side of the house, checking the windows. Most were shut tight, except the back door, slightly ajar. Abigail shot him a look. That's not a good sign. James ignored the warning bells going off in his head and pushed the door open. Inside, the air was stale, filled with dust and the faint scent of mildew. The furniture had been stripped, the walls bare. But James wasn't looking for furniture. He was looking for secrets. The study. They searched the house quickly, room by room. Nothing in the bedroom, nothing in the kitchen. Then they reached the study. It was the only room that looked untouched. A heavy wooden desk sat in the center, its drawers still intact. A bookshelf lined one wall, and faded newspapers were stacked on the floor. James moved toward the desk, his pulse quickening. He pulled open the first drawer, empty. Then the second, also empty. The third drawer was locked. James grinned. Gotcha. The hidden evidence. James pulled out the mystery key he had found in the school restroom, the one Sophie had given him. He hesitated. Couldn't be, right? He slid it into the drawer's lock. Turned it. A click. The drawer opened. Inside was a small, leather-bound notebook. James grabbed it, flipping open the pages. His breath caught. Because this wasn't just any notebook. This was Dana Holloway's research, the truth they wanted buried. The pages were filled with names, dates, locations, handwritten notes in frantic, looping cursive. Abigail peered over his shoulder, her face pale. Oh my God. The first 5 names were unfamiliar. The 6th name stopped James's heart. Sophie Langley. Abigail pressed a hand to her mouth. She was investigating Sophie's case? James flipped through the pages faster. Dana had connected the missing children. She had been days away from publishing everything. Then she died. James exhaled sharply. We need to get this out of here. Abigail nodded, fast. But the second James shut the notebook, a floorboard creaked behind them. Not alone. James turned, heart hammering. Someone stood in the shadows near the doorway. A man, dressed in dark clothing, face obscured. Watching them. James moved first. He grabbed a heavy bookend off the desk and lunged. The man was fast. He sidestepped James easily, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the bookshelf. Pain exploded across James' back. Abigail screamed. The man turned toward her, and James punched him in the ribs. The man grunted, stumbling back. James didn't waste a second. He grabbed Abigail's arm and bolted toward the front door. They sprinted out into the night air. James shoved Abigail toward the truck. Go. Go, go. He jumped into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life. In the rearview mirror, the man stood in the doorway, watching them. Then, slowly, he lifted his phone to his ear. James didn't wait to find out who he was calling. He floored the gas pedal. The chase. They sped down the empty road, adrenaline pumping. Abigail clutched the notebook to her chest. Who the hell was that? James gritted his teeth. Someone who didn't want us finding this. He glanced in the mirror. The black sedan was there, and this time, it was gaining. James tightened his grip on the wheel. They're not letting us leave alive. Abigail's breath hitched. What do we do? James exhaled slowly. Then he slammed his foot on the gas. We fight. The black sedan was gaining fast. James Carter gripped the steering wheel with both hands, his knuckles white. The truck's engine roared as he pressed the gas pedal to the floor, but the old vehicle wasn't built for speed. Abigail Monroe clutched Dana Holloway's notebook against her chest, her breath shallow. They're right behind us. James checked the rearview mirror. The sedan's headlights were locked onto them like a predator hunting its prey. They're not trying to scare us, he muttered. They're trying to shut us up. Abigail's fingers dug into the dashboard. James, we need to lose them. James nodded sharply. Hold on. A dangerous gamble. They were on an empty road, miles from the main highway. No traffic, no streetlights, just an endless stretch of darkness and the glow of their pursuers' headlights. James spotted an old construction site up ahead. Half-built roads, scattered barriers, and a service road leading into the woods. He made a split-second decision. At the last second, he yanked the wheel hard to the right. The truck skidded, tires screeching against the pavement before tearing onto the dirt road. The impact jolted them both. Dust and gravel flew everywhere. Abigail yelped, gripping her seatbelt. James! Trust me, he gritted out, fighting for control of the wheel. The black sedan followed. James cursed under his breath. They're not giving up. A desperate move. The dirt road was uneven, winding, and dangerous. The truck bounced violently as James pushed it to its limit, weaving between scattered construction equipment. But the sedan was faster. A loud bang echoed behind them. Gunfire. Abigail gasped, ducking instinctively. They're shooting at us. James swerved sharply, barely avoiding a wooden barricade. We need to end this. Now. Ahead, he saw an unfinished bridge. The road leading to it was steep, an incline that dropped into a shallow ravine below. The bridge itself? Not complete. A 10-foot gap separated one side from the other. James exhaled sharply. Abigail noticed where they were headed. Her eyes widened. James, no. But he didn't slow down. The leap of faith. The truck roared forward. The bridge loomed ahead. The black sedan was still right behind them, tires kicking up dust, closing the gap. James clenched his jaw. Hold on. With one final push, he floored the gas. The truck launched off the edge. For a split second, nothing. Just air. Weightlessness. Then, the front tires slammed down on the other side. The suspension buckled. The truck lurched forward, bouncing violently, but it made it. Abigail let out a sharp scream as they landed, gripping the door. James barely had time to breathe before he checked the mirror. The black sedan didn't stop. They were coming. James held his breath. The sedan hit the edge of the bridge and flew forward. But their angle was wrong. Instead of landing cleanly, the car's front bumper slammed against the opposite ledge. For a brief, frozen second, the car teetered. Then it dropped. The black sedan plunged into the ravine below, slamming against rocks and flipping onto its roof. A thunderous crash echoed through the night. Then silence. James and Abigail sat there, panting. James swallowed hard, gripping the wheel. You okay? Abigail nodded numbly, her face pale. I think so. James forced himself to breathe. The people in that car had tried to kill them, and now they were gone. The fallout, James pulled the truck onto the side of the road, both of them still in shock. Abigail slowly turned toward him. Do we check? James stared at the wreckage in the ravine below. Smoke curled from the twisted metal. The sedan was completely totaled. If anyone had survived, they wouldn't be chasing them tonight. James exhaled. No, we keep moving. Abigail nodded, hugging the notebook tighter. They drove in silence, leaving the wreck behind. A hidden ally. 20 minutes later, James pulled into a small motel parking lot. They needed time to process, to plan, to figure out what the hell to do next. As they stepped out of the truck, James's phone buzzed. Another unknown number. Abigail tensed. Do you answer? James inhaled deeply, then put the phone to his ear. Hello? A pause. Then a woman's voice, calm but urgent. You have something they want. James's grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? Someone who wants to see Whitmore burn. Abigail stared at him, eyes wide. The voice continued. I can help you, but you have to trust me. James's mind raced. How do I know this isn't a trap? A brief silence. Then the voice said something that made his blood run cold. Because I know where the missing children are. James's breath caught. Abigail clamped a hand over her mouth. The woman continued. Meet me at the old train station at midnight. Come alone. Click. The line went dead. James lowered the phone slowly. Abigail whispered, James, what do we do? James clenched his jaw. We go. But deep down, he knew. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back. James Carter sat in the motel parking lot, gripping the steering wheel, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. Because I know where the missing children are. The words from the mysterious caller echoed in his mind, looping over and over. Beside him, Abigail Monroe sat rigid, clutching Dana Holloway's notebook like a lifeline. James, this could be a trap. James exhaled, staring through the windshield. I know. Abigail turned toward him, voice low. But we're going anyway, aren't we? James looked at her. They both knew the answer. There was no turning back. A midnight meeting. The old train station sat at the edge of town, long abandoned, the tracks rusted and warped. The once busy depot was now just a shell of crumbling brick and shattered windows. James parked a block away, scanning the area. No cars, no movement. But that didn't mean they weren't being watched. Abigail touched his arm. I should come with you? James shook his head. If it's a setup, I need you to be my way out. Abigail hesitated, then nodded, gripping her phone. If you're not back in 20 minutes, I'm coming in. James stepped out into the cold night air, heart pounding. The informant. He entered through a side door, the hinges groaning under the strain. The inside of the station was pitch black, save for the faint glow of the moon through the broken roof. Then, a faint shuffle ahead. James tensed. I'm here. A shadow emerged from behind an old ticket booth. A woman. She was in her early 50s, dressed in dark clothes, a baseball cap pulled low over her graying hair. Her eyes, sharp and wary, studied him in the dim light. You brought the notebook? She asked. James kept his grip firm on the leather-bound book in his hand. Who are you? The woman sighed. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that you're running out of time. James didn't move. Then start talking. The woman exhaled and took a slow step forward. The children. You were right. Whitmore was involved, but not alone. There's a network. They've been operating for years, using schools to target vulnerable kids. James felt his blood run cold. A network. That explained the missing reports, the erased files. This wasn't just a corrupt principal covering his tracks. This was organized. James' voice was low. Where are the kids? The woman hesitated. Most are gone. They were moved. New towns, new names. She swallowed hard. But one is still here. James' heart slammed against his ribs. Who? The woman's gaze flickered. Sophie Langley. James felt like the air had been knocked from his lungs. Sophie. The little girl who started all of this. The day you found her in the bathroom? The woman continued. That was their mistake. She wasn't supposed to escape. They were planning to move her that night. James's hands clenched into fists. Who took her? The woman looked away. Then finally she whispered, someone inside the school. James took a slow step forward. Who? The woman exhaled. A teacher. James's pulse pounded. Which one? The woman's lips parted to answer. Bang! The bullet shattered the glass window behind them. James dived behind an overturned bench, yanking the woman down with him. Gunfire ripped through the train station, echoing in the empty space. The woman clutched her side, her breath ragged. They found us? James pulled his gun. He didn't know if they were after him or her, but it didn't matter. They weren't leaving here in one piece. The attack. James peeked over the bench. 3 figures, dressed in dark clothing, moving fast. The woman groaned, clutching her bleeding side. You need to run. James ignored her, firing a shot. One of the men ducked behind a column, returning fire. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, kicking up dust and debris. James cursed. They were pinned. He turned to the woman. Where's Sophie? The woman grimaced in pain. A house on the east side of town. She's still there, but not for long. James felt his blood turn to ice. They were planning to move her again, which meant if they didn't get to her tonight, they might never see her again. The woman grabbed his wrist, eyes desperate. Save her. James hesitated. What about you? The woman's face twisted in pain. I won't make it, but Sophie can. James gritted his teeth. More gunfire erupted, forcing him lower. He had seconds to decide. Stay and fight, or run and save Sophie. His grip tightened on the notebook. Then, he bolted. A desperate escape. James raced toward the side exit, bullets whizzing past him. The woman fired one last shot behind him, giving him cover. Then, silence. James burst into the cold night air, sprinting for the truck. Abigail was already in the driver's seat, eyes wide with panic. Go! James shouted, leaping in. Abigail slammed the gas. As they tore away, James looked back at the train station. The woman was gone. The gunmen were searching the area, but they weren't after him anymore. Because now, they knew where he was going, and he was running out of time. One last chance. James gritted his teeth, looking at Abigail. "We have to get to Sophie, right now." Abigail's hands tightened on the wheel. "Where is she?" James exhaled. And then finally he said, "She's been in danger this whole time, and we never saw it." Abigail frowned. "James, who has her?" James met her gaze. "The one person we never suspected." James Carter gripped the dashboard as Abigail Monroe swerved the truck onto the main road, tires screeching against the pavement. They had barely escaped the ambush at the train station, but James couldn't shake the weight of the woman's final words. Sophie is still in danger, and the person keeping her is someone inside the school. His gut twisted. They had been looking at Whitmore this whole time, but now, someone else had betrayed them. And if they didn't figure it out fast, Sophie Langley would disappear forever, a name they never considered. Abigail's knuckles were white as she gripped the steering wheel. "James, tell me you have a name." James exhaled sharply, his mind racing. The school had over a dozen teachers, staff members, counselors, coaches, but who had access to vulnerable children? Who had a reason to be close to Sophie? Who could have taken her without anyone questioning it? His breath hitched. No, it couldn't be. He turned to Abigail, his voice low. "It's the school counselor." Abigail snapped her head toward him. "What?" James nodded, the pieces clicking into place. "It makes sense. Sophie's been struggling since her father died. Who would have access to her, alone with no questions asked?" Abigail swallowed hard. "Counselor Evan Marshall." James' jaw clenched. "He's been hiding in plain sight." The clock is ticking. James yanked out his phone and called the school's emergency line. No answer. He dialed the principal's office, straight to voicemail. Abigail gripped his arm. "James, what if they're already moving her?" James shoved his phone back into his pocket. "We're about to find out." He reached under his seat and pulled out his 9mm pistol. Abigail's eyes widened. "Jesus, James." James loaded the chamber, his expression cold. No more warnings. Redwood Elementary. After hours. The school was dark when they arrived, the parking lot nearly empty. But there was one car still there, a silver sedan. James recognized it immediately. Evan Marshall's car. James and Abigail moved quickly, keeping to the shadows as they approached the school entrance. James tried the main doors. Locked. Of course. Abigail grabbed his arm. "How do we get in?" James didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his janitor's keys and slid one into the lock. A soft click. The door swung open. They stepped inside, the hallways eerily silent. The counselor's office. James led the way toward Marshall's office, heart hammering. As they neared the door, he motioned for Abigail to stay back. Then, slowly, he pressed his ear to the wood. A muffled voice. Then, a soft whimper. James' blood ran cold. Sophie. She was in there. James gripped the doorknob, bracing himself. Then, without hesitation, he slammed his shoulder against the door. The lock snapped. The door burst open. The face of a monster. The sight inside the room made James's stomach churn. Sophie Langley sat curled up on a counseling couch, her wrists bound with zip ties. Tears streaked her face as she flinched at the sudden noise. And standing beside her, Evan Marshall. The school counselor whipped around, his face twisting in surprise, but not fear, because he wasn't caught off guard. No, he had been waiting for them. James raised his gun, voice deadly. "Step away from her, now." Marshall didn't move. He just smiled. "You're too late," he said calmly. James' grip on the gun tightened. "Untie her." Marshall sighed, shaking his head. James, you think you're the hero, don't you?" James ignored the bait. "I said untie her." Marshall's smile widened. Then, he reached into his pocket. James fired a warning shot, shattering a lamp just inches from Marshall's head. "Don't." James' voice was a growl. Marshall froze. Slowly, he pulled his hand out, revealing a small remote, a single red button at its center. James's stomach dropped. Marshall tilted his head. "You should have stayed out of this." Then, he pressed the button. The explosion. The building shook. A violent explosion rocked the far end of the school, shaking the floors and blowing out the windows. Sophie screamed. James stumbled back, barely keeping his footing. Fire and smoke billowed from the east hallway, the scent of burning wood filling the air. Marshall laughed. "You really thought this would end with you winning?" he sneered. James's anger boiled over. He lunged forward, grabbing Marshall by the collar and slamming him against the wall. Marshall grunted in pain, but his grin never faded. "It's too late," he whispered. "You're too late." James's fist crashed into his face. Marshall collapsed to the floor, unconscious. James turned to Abigail, who was already untying Sophie. The little girl threw herself into James's arms, sobbing. He held her tightly. Then he looked at Abigail. They had Sophie. But the school was on fire, and they had less than 2 minutes to get out. Fire. Thick, black smoke poured through the school hallways, the flames spreading fast. The explosion had been deliberate, meant to cover up evidence and ensure that James Carter, Abigail Monroe, and Sophie Langley never made it out alive. James coughed violently, tightening his grip around Sophie, who clung to his neck, her small body trembling. Abigail grabbed his arm. "We have to move. Now." Behind them, Evan Marshall lay unconscious, blood trickling from his split lip. James glanced at him once, then at the growing fire, swallowing up the eastern wing of the school. There was no time to waste. "Go," James shouted, leading the way into the hallway. A school-turned death trap. The once familiar hallways of Redwood Elementary had turned into a maze of fire and destruction. The explosion had taken out part of the ceiling, and flaming debris littered the floor. Alarms blared. Sparks rained down from exposed electrical wires. The air was thick with smoke. Sophie coughed violently, choking on the fumes. James ripped off his jacket and wrapped it around her, covering her mouth and nose. "Breathe through this," he instructed. She nodded weakly. Abigail shielded her own face with her sleeve. "The front entrance is blocked. We need another way out." James scanned the chaos ahead. The main exit was engulfed in flames, which meant the gym, he said. "It has an emergency exit." Abigail didn't hesitate. "Then we go through the gym." James adjusted Sophie's weight in his arms. "Stay close." Then they ran. An unexpected threat. James led them through the smoke-filled corridors, dodging falling ceiling tiles and flaming wreckage. They turned the last corner toward the gym and froze. A man stood in their path, dressed in black, gun in hand. James instinctively pulled Sophie closer, stepping in front of Abigail. The man smirked. "Going somewhere?" James' mind raced. He recognized this guy. He was one of the men from the black sedan, the one that had chased them off the road, which meant Whitmore's people were already here. The man lifted his gun, aiming it directly at Sophie. James's blood ran cold. "Hand over the girl," the man ordered. Abigail tensed beside him. "Like hell we will." The man cocked his head. "You don't have a choice." James' grip tightened around Sophie. Then, a loud groan from above. James's eyes flicked up just in time to see a section of the burning ceiling start to collapse. "Move!" he roared. He dove to the side, Abigail right behind him. The ceiling caved in, crashing down on the man, burying him under burning debris. A sickening crunch. Then, silence. James coughed, shielding Sophie's face from the embers. Abigail gasped for breath. "Is he?" James didn't bother checking. "Doesn't matter, we need to go." They bolted toward the gym doors. The final obstacle, James slammed into the doors and cursed. "Locked." "Stand back," he barked. Abigail yanked Sophie away just as James lifted his boot and kicked. Crack. The doors burst open and they stumbled into the smoke-filled gymnasium. Across the room, the emergency exit. Freedom. James felt a surge of hope. Then a voice from behind. "Well, well, well." James turned, heart hammering. Standing at the top of the bleachers, Principal Douglas Whitmore, dressed impeccably in his usual suit and tie, calm, unbothered, like he hadn't just tried to kill them. James gritted his teeth. "You're out of time, Whitmore." Whitmore chuckled. "On the contrary," he stepped forward, blocking their path to the exit. "This ends now." James tightened his grip on Sophie. "Yeah, it does." Whitmore sighed, shaking his head. "You think you've won? You have no idea who you're dealing with." James snorted. "A coward in a suit?" Whitmore's jaw tensed. "You don't get it, do you? I'm just one piece of this operation." James's muscles coiled. "Then I guess I'll have to take the whole damn thing down." Whitmore's calm expression twisted. "You really should have taken my warning." Then, he reached into his coat. James reacted instantly. He set Sophie down, pushing her toward Abigail. "Run?" Abigail hesitated, but only for a second. She scooped Sophie into her arms and bolted for the exit. Whitmore pulled a gun. James lunged. The final fight. James slammed into Whitmore, knocking the gun aside just as it went off. The bullet grazed James's arm, but he barely registered the pain. They crashed onto the gym floor, grappling for control. Whitmore was stronger than he looked. But James was angrier. He drove his fist into Whitmore's ribs, then another into his jaw. Whitmore grunted in pain, but he still fought back. The flames outside the gym grew higher, the heat scorching the air. James grabbed Whitmore's wrist and twisted, forcing the gun loose. The weapon skidded across the floor. Whitmore snarled, swinging wildly. James dodged, then landed the final punch. Whitmore collapsed. Breathing hard, James staggered to his feet. Abigail stood at the exit, holding the door open. "James, we have to go." James grabbed Whitmore's gun and backed away. Whitmore clutched his ribs, coughing. "This won't stop them," he rasped. James stared down at him, chest heaving. "Maybe not," he said. Then he turned and ran, into the night. They burst outside, the cool air hitting them like a wave. Sophie was sobbing against Abigail's shoulder. James scooped her up, holding her tight. Behind them, the school collapsed in a storm of fire and smoke. Whitmore was still inside. James didn't look back. They had won this battle. But the war? It was just beginning. The flames from Redwood Elementary painted the night sky in hues of orange and red, the fire roaring as if it were consuming more than just a building. It was consuming secrets, destroying evidence, and burying Douglas Whitmore along with it. James Carter stood in the empty parking lot, holding Sophie Langley tightly against his chest. The little girl trembled, her small fingers digging into his jacket. Abigail Monroe stood beside them, her face pale, streaked with ashes and sweat. None of them spoke. They had escaped. But they weren't safe. Sirens and lies. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, the blue and red flashes cutting through the smoke-filled darkness. James's heart sank. "We have to go," Abigail whispered. James clenched his jaw. "We can't." Abigail turned to him, eyes filled with panic. "James." "They're gonna spin this," he said, voice tight. "You know they will. Whitmore's people aren't gone. They'll bury the truth, just like they've done before." Abigail swallowed. "Then what do we do?" James exhaled sharply. "We tell them everything." Abigail hesitated. "And if they don't believe us?" James stared at the burning school. "They will." The police arrive. Minutes later, the first patrol cars screeched into the lot. Uniformed officers rushed out, guns drawn, barking orders. "Hands in the air." James raised his hands slowly. "We're unarmed." Abigail did the same, holding on to Sophie protectively. A tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped forward. Sheriff Grant Mathers, a veteran lawman known for playing things by the book. He eyed James carefully. "Carter?" James nodded. Mathers' gaze flicked to the school. His expression darkened. "What the hell happened here?" James inhaled deeply. "It's a long story," he said, "but it starts with a principal who wasn't working alone." Mathers' jaw tightened. "Let's take this downtown. A system that protects itself." At the county police station, James and Abigail sat in a cold, sterile interrogation room. Sophie had been taken to a separate room with child services, where a kind-looking woman was speaking to her in hushed tones. James's patience was running thin. They had been sitting for almost 2 hours. No lawyer, no questions. Just waiting. Finally, Sheriff Mathers entered, his expression unreadable. He dropped a file onto the table. James saw the headline clipped inside. "Fire destroys elementary school, principal presumed dead." He clenched his fists. "You already wrote the story?" Mathers exhaled. "It's what the public will hear." James narrowed his eyes. "And what about the real story?" Mathers stared at him for a long moment. Then he shut off the security camera in the room. James felt his stomach tighten. "This is bigger than you, Carter," Mathers said, voice low. "Bigger than me." James leaned forward. "Then tell me, who's really pulling the strings?" Mathers hesitated. "The Van Crest Group." James' blood ran cold. "The real enemy?" Abigail frowned. "Who?" Mathers sighed, rubbing his temple. "A private organization, powerful people. They control funding, influence school boards, and, apparently—" He looked at James. "They decide what stays buried." James felt sick. "So what now?" he asked. "You cover it up?" Mathers hesitated. Then, quietly, he slid an envelope across the table. Inside, a flash drive. James frowned. "What is this?" Mathers kept his voice low. "Evidence. Files they didn't delete. Names, transfers, other missing children." James's breath hitched. Mathers exhaled. "I don't have the power to stop this. But you? You might." James stared at the drive. "Why help us?" Mathers smirked. "Because I hate being told what to do." He stood up, adjusting his belt. "You two are free to go, but if I were you—" His expression darkened. "I'd disappear." A choice that can't be undone. James and Abigail walked out of the station just before dawn. Sophie was safe. The case was closed. At least that's what they wanted people to believe. Abigail rubbed her arms. What now? James looked down at the flash drive. The final piece of the puzzle. He could take it to the press. He could expose everything. Or he could disappear, just like Mathers suggested. For the first time in his life, James hesitated. Then he made his choice. James clenched his fist around the drive. We end this. James Carter sat in the passenger seat of the truck, staring at the flash drive in his hand. It felt heavy, not in weight, but in consequences. Inside this small device was the truth. Evidence of a network of corruption, trafficking, and cover-ups. A truth that could destroy powerful people, but exposing it? That would put a target on their backs. Beside him, Abigail Monroe tightened her grip on the steering wheel. James, if we do this, there's no going back. James exhaled. I know. They had spent years uncovering what was wrong. Now they had a chance to burn it all down, and that's exactly what they were going to do. Reaching out to the press. They parked a few blocks away from the Redwood Chronicle, the only local newspaper not owned by corporate interests. James knew one reporter who might listen. Ryan Delgado, an old-school journalist, one of the few left who actually cared about the truth. James pulled out his phone and dialed. A few rings. Then, Delgado. James didn't waste time. Ryan, it's James Carter. A pause, then a sharp intake of breath. Jesus, Carter, what the hell did you do? James's stomach tightened. You already heard? Your name is all over the news, man. School janitor linked to Redwood Elementary fire. They're making you look like a damn criminal. James clenched his jaw. I need to see you. Now. Delgado hesitated. Then, voice low, he said, meet me in an hour. Same diner as before. Click. The setup. James and Abigail arrived at Murphy's Diner, a quiet 24-hour joint on the edge of town. Delgado was already there, seated in a booth, stirring his coffee. The second they sat down, he slid a manila folder across the table. James opened it. Inside were printouts of news articles, online posts, and police reports. Every single one framed James as the villain, a disgruntled janitor, a troublemaker, a possible arsonist. Abigail's hands trembled. They're burying us. Delgado nodded grimly. They're not just burying you, they're rewriting the story. James gritted his teeth. That's why we need to go public, before they erase us completely. Delgado leaned forward. You have proof? James pulled out the flash drive. Delgado took it, inspecting it like it was radioactive. What's on here? Everything, James said. Names, transactions, records of the missing kids. Delgado's face went pale. Then he swallowed hard. This could get me killed. James didn't blink. Then you better make sure it gets out before they stop you. Delgado stared at him. Then, finally, he nodded. The hit comes fast. They walked out of the diner just past midnight. The second James stepped into the parking lot, he knew something was wrong. Too quiet, too empty. Then, the first bullet hit the truck's windshield. James grabbed Abigail and pulled her down behind a parked car. Delgado dived behind a dumpster, cursing. Across the lot, two men in dark suits emerged from a black SUV, guns drawn. James' blood ran cold. They had been waiting. A fight for survival. James reached for his gun, but Abigail grabbed his arm. James, no, we can't win this fight. He knew she was right, but he wasn't about to die in a parking lot. He turned to Delgado. Do you have a car? Delgado nodded. 2 blocks east. James gritted his teeth. Then we run. Abigail's eyes widened. You're insane. James glanced over the car, counting seconds between shots. Then, without warning, he bolted. Abigail and Delgado followed. Bullets whizzed past them, shattering glass and denting metal. They rounded a corner, sprinting down an alley. James pushed forward, lungs burning. The SUV's engine roared behind them. Then, Delgado's car. James yanked open the door, shoving Abigail inside. Delgado jumped into the driver's seat and hit the gas. The tires squealed as they tore onto the main road. Nowhere left to hide. They didn't stop driving for an hour. Finally, somewhere along the state highway, Delgado pulled into an abandoned gas station. No signs of pursuit. James exhaled, pressing his head against the seat. Delgado turned, face pale as a ghost. We can't do this in Redwood. James looked at him. What do you mean? Delgado ran a hand over his face. This story is too big. If we publish in the local press, it'll be buried before sunrise. Abigail frowned. Then where do we take it? Delgado hesitated. Then, voice low, he said, Washington, D.C. James' pulse spiked. Delgado met his gaze. We take it to the big leagues, the national press, someone too big for Van Crest to silence. Abigail swallowed hard. Do you have contacts there? Delgado nodded. One, a federal journalist with connections inside the Justice Department. James took a slow breath. This was it, their last shot. We take it to D.C., he said firmly, and we burn them down. Delgado exhaled. Then let's go. The war isn't over. As they pulled back onto the highway, James stared out at the darkened road ahead. He knew this wasn't the end. Van Crest wouldn't just let them walk away. But this time, James wasn't running. He was taking the fight to them. And by the time he was done, there wouldn't be anything left to hide. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, illuminated only by the truck's headlights cutting through the darkness. James Carter sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, his mind running through 1,000 worst-case scenarios. Beside him, Ryan Delgado gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. Abigail Monroe sat in the back seat, holding on to Sophie, who had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep. They were running out of time. The flash drive containing the truth, the proof of Van Crest's crimes, was hidden in James's jacket pocket. If they could just reach Washington, D.C. and hand it over to Delgado's contact, the story would be too big to silence. But they weren't safe yet, and James knew Van Crest wasn't finished with them. Being hunted. Abigail checked the side mirror, her expression tense. Still no sign of them. James didn't relax. They're out there. Delgado sighed. We've been on the road for 6 hours. If they were going to hit us, they'd have done it by now. James shook his head. No, they don't want to just kill us. His grip tightened around his knee. They want to control the story. That meant Van Crest would be waiting at their destination, and James wasn't about to walk into an ambush. A dangerous detour. As the first hint of sunrise began creeping over the horizon, James made a decision. We need to change cars, he said suddenly. Delgado frowned. What? They'll be tracking us. License plates, traffic cameras, maybe even the car itself. James met his gaze. We switch vehicles. We buy time. Delgado hesitated. Where the hell do we get another car? James pulled out his phone and typed something in. Then he turned the screen toward them. A small remote gas station off the interstate. There, Abigail sighed. Let's just hope we're not already too late. Trouble at the gas station. They pulled into the station 20 minutes later. It was the kind of place no one really stopped at, just a couple of rundown pumps, an old convenience store, and a flickering neon open sign. James stepped out first, scanning the area. No black SUVs, no suspicious figures. Yet. Abigail carried Sophie inside while James and Delgado approached the only other car at the pumps, an old beat-up sedan, the driver nowhere in sight. Delgado frowned. You know how to hotwire? James smirked. I was a janitor, not a criminal. Delgado sighed. So what's the plan? Before James could answer, a gun cocked behind him. Ambush. Hands where I can see 'em. James froze. He turned his head slowly. A man in a dark suit stood behind them, gun drawn. Another one flanked him, 2 Van Crest operatives. Delgado muttered under his breath. Of course. The first man gestured toward the convenience store. Inside, now. James locked eyes with Delgado. Just one chance. He moved fast. James whipped around, grabbing the first man's wrist and slamming it into the gas pump. The gun went off, shattering a side mirror, but James was already swinging, his fist connected with the guy's throat. The second man fired, but Delgado dropped low, kicking his legs out from under him. The gun clattered to the pavement. James didn't hesitate. He grabbed the gun, turned, and fired once. The first man went down. The second man tried to crawl away, reaching for a radio. Bang! Delgado finished him. Silence. James wiped blood from his lip. Well, that was subtle. Delgado exhaled. They're gonna know we're still alive. James nodded. Then we better move. Last leg of the journey. They grabbed the sedan and switched cars within minutes. Abigail and Sophie rushed out of the convenience store just as James gunned the engine. They were back on the road. But now, Van Crest knew they weren't dead, and they would throw everything they had at stopping them. The final roadblock. As they neared the Virginia border, James felt the shift. Traffic slowed. A row of black SUVs lined the upcoming exit. Abigail's breath hitched. They know. James's pulse quickened. He gripped the wheel. No more running. Delgado frowned. What the hell does that mean? James pressed harder on the gas. Abigail's eyes widened. James, what are you? He took the off-ramp, head-on toward the blockade. Delgado cursed. "This is insane." James didn't blink. He was done running. A plan that could get them killed. The SUVs in front of them shifted. A team of armed men stepped out, guns raised. A trap. But James had one last trick. He looked at Abigail. "Take Sophie and Delgado and get out the second I stop." Abigail's eyes went wide. "James, you get to DC," he said firmly. "You get to the journalist, no matter what." She shook her head. "No, we do this together." James' grip on the wheel tightened, but before he could answer, a voice came through the SUV loudspeaker. "James Carter, get out of the car with your hands up." James exhaled slowly. He turned to Abigail. "You trust me?" She swallowed hard. Then she nodded. James looked ahead. This was it. The final showdown. And he wasn't leaving without a fight. The black SUVs blocked the road ahead, their engines rumbling like predators waiting to strike. Armed men in dark tactical gear stood in formation, their weapons trained directly on James Carter. Abigail Monroe's breath was shaky as she clutched Sophie tightly. Ryan Delgado's hands trembled on the flash drive, the one piece of evidence that could bring Van Crest down. James gripped the steering wheel. His heartbeat was steady. "No more running." The loudspeaker crackled again. "James Carter, step out of the vehicle. Hands where we can see them." James exhaled slowly. Then he turned to Abigail. "Take Sophie and Delgado. Run when I tell you." Abigail's eyes widened. "James, no." He grabbed her hand, squeezing it. "They don't want me. They want the evidence. You get it to DC, you make sure the world knows." Delgado swallowed. "And what about you?" James smirked. "I'll keep them busy." Then, before they could argue, James slammed the gas pedal. Straight into the fire. The car screeched forward, tires spinning against the pavement. The Van Crest operatives reacted instantly. Gunfire erupted. Bullets shattered the windshield, but James didn't slow down. He yanked the wheel, hard right, sending the car into a violent spin. The moment it skidded to a stop, "Go!" James roared. Abigail threw the back door open, grabbing Sophie and Delgado, sprinting toward the tree line. The operatives tried to react, but James made sure they couldn't. He kicked open his door and fired 2 shots. Bang! 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 One man dropped. The others scrambled for cover. James dived behind the car, breathing hard. He was outnumbered, outgunned, but not out yet. Face to face with the enemy, boots crunched against the pavement. Then, a slow, measured clap. James peeked over the hood of the car. A man in a gray suit stepped forward. Unlike the others, he wasn't wearing tactical gear. No mask, no rifle, just calm, unreadable eyes. James knew exactly who he was. Malcolm Reed, one of Van Crest's top executives. The man who had orchestrated everything from the shadows. Reed smiled. "You've caused us quite a bit of trouble, Mr. Carter." James wiped blood from his lip. "Yeah, well, I'm a janitor. Cleaning up messes is my job." Reed chuckled. "And what a mess this is." He motioned toward the trees. "But it's pointless. Your friends won't get far. My men are already moving to intercept them." James's pulse spiked. Reed sighed. "Tell me where they're going. Hand over the evidence, and I'll make sure you don't suffer." James gritted his teeth. "Go to hell." Reed smirked. "Have it your way." He nodded. The nearest operative lifted his gun. Bang! A shot rang out. The operative collapsed. An unexpected savior. Chaos erupted. Another gunshot, then another. James' eyes darted toward the tree line. And there, moving like a ghost in the night, Sheriff Grant Mathers, holding a rifle and taking down Van Crest operatives one by one. Reed's face twisted in rage. "Who the hell?" Bang! A shot clipped Reed's shoulder, making him stumble back. James didn't waste a second. He lunged forward, grabbing Reed by the collar and slamming him against the car. Reed grunted, coughing blood. James leaned in. "It's over." Reed laughed weakly. "No, Carter." He winced. "You're just cutting off one head. The body survives." James's jaw clenched. Then he punched Reed across the face. The man slumped to the ground unconscious, the final escape. More sirens. James turned. Mathers ran toward him. "We need to go. Now." James looked past him, saw Abigail, Delgado, and Sophie disappearing down a dirt path. "Safe. For now." James exhaled. "Can you hold them off?" Mathers reloaded his rifle. "I'll buy you 5 minutes. No more." James nodded. "That's all I need." Then he ran, away from the burning wreckage of the fight, toward the only chance they had left. One last move left to play. By the time James reached the road, Abigail and Delgado were already inside a new car. Sophie was curled up in the back seat, silent. James threw open the door. Abigail looked at him, fear in her eyes. "Tell me we're getting out of this." James climbed into the driver's seat. "We're getting out of this." Then he hit the gas. The tires spun, and they disappeared into the night. With one final destination, Washington, D.C., the last battle was waiting. The Washington, D.C. skyline loomed in the distance as James Carter gripped the wheel, his eyes locked on the road ahead. They had been driving for hours, stopping only when absolutely necessary. No distractions, no turning back. Beside him, Abigail Monroe checked her phone. "We're 15 minutes out." In the back seat, Ryan Delgado clutched the flash drive containing all the evidence they had fought so hard to obtain. Sophie Langley slept soundly in Abigail's arms, oblivious to the war raging around her. James's jaw tightened. This was it. Their last shot at bringing Van Crest down. And James wasn't leaving without finishing what he started. The final contact. Delgado's contact in D.C. was a high-level investigative journalist, Kara Bennett, known for exposing government corruption and surviving multiple assassination attempts. If anyone could blow the lid off Van Crest, it was her. James pulled into an underground parking garage, his hands steady despite the storm raging inside him. Delgado dialed. "We're here." A voice crackled on the other end. "Level 3. Black SUV. Get in fast." James took a slow breath. "Let's move." Delivering the evidence. They made their way to the black SUV, scanning for threats. A woman in her mid-40s stepped out, sharp eyes assessing them. "Kara Bennett." "You have it?" she asked. Delgado handed her the flash drive. "Everything. Names, dates, transactions, proof of the network." Kara plugged it into a laptop and skimmed the files. After a few seconds, her eyes widened. "Holy shit," she muttered. James crossed his arms. "Enough to bring them down?" Kara looked up. "Enough to set the world on fire. The last betrayal before anyone could react." A gun cocked. James turned instantly. Delgado staggered backward, eyes wide. A single bullet hole in his chest. Blood spread across his shirt. James caught him before he hit the ground. Delgado gasped. "James?" His body went limp. James's pulse spiked. He spun, gun drawn, and saw who pulled the trigger. Sheriff Grant Mathers. James' stomach dropped. Abigail's breath hitched. "No." Mathers adjusted his grip on his pistol. His face was calm, cold, professional. "I told you," Mathers said, voice even. "You should have disappeared." James' mind raced. They had trusted him. He had saved them. And all along, he had been working for Van Crest. One last standoff. Kara Bennett slowly raised her hands. "Listen, we can talk about this." Mathers ignored her. His gun was trained on James. "Hand over the girl." James stepped in front of Sophie. "Not a chance." Mathers sighed. "You don't understand. This doesn't stop. If you walk out of here, they'll find you. They'll find her. You can't win." James' grip on his gun tightened. "I don't need to win." His voice was steady. "I just need you to lose." Mathers smirked. "Wrong answer." Then James fired first. The bullet hit Mathers in the shoulder. Mathers staggered back, cursing, but didn't go down. He raised his gun. Bang! Another shot, straight to the chest. Mathers collapsed. His gun clattered to the ground. Silence. Then, Sophie whimpered. James turned. Abigail was holding Sophie tightly, shielding her. Mathers was dead. It was over. The story breaks. Kara wasted no time. She slammed the laptop shut and grabbed her phone. "I'm pushing this live right now." She started typing furiously, uploading files. James and Abigail watched as headlines began flooding online. Breaking news: national trafficking ring exposed, ties to government officials, millions in secret transactions uncovered, Van Crest under investigation. High-level cover-up leads to mysterious deaths. James exhaled. They had done it. The truth was out. The aftermath. Within hours, arrests began nationwide. Multiple Van Crest executives were taken into FBI custody. Assets were frozen, investigations launched, and Sophie Langley's case was reopened. The entire country was watching. One last goodbye. A few days later, James stood outside a small foster home, watching as Sophie played in the yard. She was safe now. Abigail walked up beside him. "They offered to put us into protective custody." James shook his head. "No more hiding." She smiled softly. "So what now?" James looked out at the horizon. Then he smiled. "We keep fighting." Abigail nodded. "Together?" James turned to her. "Always." And for the first time in a long time, he felt free. The war wasn't over. But this battle, they had won.